Chapter 26 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. James Murchison, walking along the pavement of Wilton High Street with the sharp, savage strides of a man tortured by his own thoughts, turned into Dr. Tugler's surgery as the clock struck 8, finding in his stern routine a power to steady him against despair. He slipped off his overcoat, folded it slowly and methodically over the back of a bench, and hung his hat on one of the gas brackets projecting from the wall. To John Tugler, who was seated at one of the tables, examining a girl with a red rash covering her face, there was something in the big man's slow and restrained patience that betrayed how sorrow was shadowing his assistant's home. John Tugler pushed back his chair and crossed the room to the corner where Murchison was bending over his open instrument bag. The droop of the shoulders, the whole pose of the powerful figure, told of the burden that lay heavy upon the father's heart. Murchison. The face that met John Tugler's was haggard and stupid with 2 sleepless nights. Yes. Any news? Oh, worse. And he snapped the bag to with an irritable closure of the hands. John Tugler looked at him as he might have looked at a refractory friend. "Come now, Murchison, you're feeling damned bad. Knock off today. Starman and I can manage." "Thanks, I must work." "Must, eh?" "It helps." "Like punching something when you're savage. Perhaps you're right." Tugler returned to the girl with the red rash, while Murchison passed on to the surgery, where some half-score patients were waiting to be treated. "Good morning," and he glanced round him like a man in a hurry. "First case. Well, how's the leg?" A scraggy, undersized individual with a narrow, swarthy face was pulling up a trousers leg with 2 dirty, drug-stained hands. He was a worker in a chemical factory, and his ugly, harsh, and suspicious features seemed to have taken the low moral stamp of the place. "No worse, doctor." "No worse? Well, have you been resting?" "Half and half." "I suppose so. You may as well come here and grumble for months unless you do what we tell you. It is quite useless continuing like this." He bent down and began to unwind the dirty bandage from the man's leg. The chemical worker expanded the broad nostrils of his carnivorous nose, sniffed, and cocked a battered bowler onto the back of his head. Manners were not mended in Dr. Tugler's surgery. "God's truth, doctor, easy with it." Murchison had stripped a sodden pad of lint and plaster from the ulcer on the man's leg. "Nonsense, that didn't hurt you." "Beg to differ, sir." "When did you dress this last?" The patient hesitated, eyeing Murchison sulkily as though tempted to be insolent. "Yesterday." "Speak the truth, and say 3 days ago. You're on the club, of course." "Well, what's the harm?" "And you don't trouble much how long you draw club money, eh?" "That's your business, I reckon." "My business, is it? Well, my friend, you carry out my instructions, or there will be trouble about the certificate. You understand?" The man cast an evil look at Murchison's broad back as he turned to spread boracic ointment on clean lint. "I don't know as how I come here to hear your sauce," he remarked curtly. Murchison faced him with an irritable glitter of the eyes. "What do you mean?" "I suppose some of us poor fellows cost you gentlemen too much in tow and flannel. There you are just a little at sea, my friend. What we do is to prevent the friendly societies being imposed upon by loafers. Dress your leg every day. Rest it, you understand, and keep out of the pubs. You had better come by some manners before next week." The chemical worker snarled out some vague retort, and then relapsed into silence. Such shufflers had no pity from James Murchison. He was in no mood that morning to bear with the impertinences of malingerers and humbugs. The clock struck 11 before the last patient passed out into Wilton High Street, with its thundering drays and clanging trams. Murchison had done the work of 2 men in the surgery that morning, silent, skilful, and determined, a man who worked that the savage smart of sorrow might be soothed and assuaged thereby. With the women and the children he was very gentle and very patient. His hands were never rough and never clumsy. Perhaps none of the people whose wounds he dressed guessed how bitter a wound was bleeding in the heart of this sad-eyed, patient-faced man. John Tugler sidled in when Murchison had pinned up the last bandage. He swung the door to gently, sighed, and pretended to examine the entries in the ledger. Murchison was washing his hands at the sink, staring hard at the water as it splashed from the tap upon his fingers. "Not much visiting today?" "No." "I'll hire a cab and drive down to Black End. Most of them seem to lie that way." Murchison was looking for a clean place in the roller towel. "I can manage the visiting down there," he said. John Tugler surveyed him attentively over a fat shoulder. "You'll knock up, old man," he remarked quietly. Murchison started. The familiarity had a touch of tenderness that lifted it from its vulgar setting. "Thanks, no." "Very bad, is she?" "Comatose." "Oh, damn!" The little man whipped over the leaves of the ledger as though looking for something that he could not find. "It seems a beastly shame," he said presently. "Shame?" "Yes, this sort of smash-up of a youngster's life. They call it Providence or the Divine Will or something of that sort, don't they? Must say I can't stick that sort of bosh." Murchison was wringing his hands fiercely in the folds of the rough towel. "It is a natural judgment, I suppose," he said. "A judgment? It was my fault that the child ever came here. It need not have been so." And he broke off with a savage twisting of the mouth. John Tugler ran one finger slowly across a blank space in the ledger. "Don't take it that way," he said slowly. "It doesn't help a man to curse himself because a damned bug of a bacillus breeds in this holy horror of a town. Curse the British Constitution, the lawmongers, or the local money shufflers who'd rather save 3 farthings than clean their slums." James Murchison was silent. Yet in his heart there burned the fierce conviction that the father's frailty had been visited upon the innocent body of the child. 4 o'clock had struck, and the houses were casting long shadows across the waters of the canal before Murchison turned in at the gate of Clovelly after 3 hours' visiting in the Wilton slums. He let himself in silently with his latch-key, hung his hat and coat in the hall, and entered the little front room where tea was laid on the imitation walnut table. On the sofa by the window he found Catherine asleep, her head resting against the wall. It was as though sheer weariness, the spell of many sleepless nights, had fallen on her, and that but a momentary slacking of her self-control had suffered nature to assert her sway. Murchison stood looking at his wife in silence. Sleep had wiped out much of the sorrow from her face, and she seemed beautiful as Beatrice, dreaming strange dreams upon the walls of heaven. A stray strand of March sunlight had woven itself into her hair. Her hands lay open beside her on the sofa, open, palms upward, with a quaint suggestion of trustfulness and appeal. To Murchison it seemed that if God but saw her thus, such prayers as she had uttered would be answered out of pity for the brave sweetness of her womanhood. If peace lingered in sleep, there would be sorrow in her waking. Murchison was loath to recall her to the world of coarse reality and unpitying truth. A great tenderness, a strong man's tenderness for a woman and a wife, softened his face as he watched the quiet drawing of her breath. And yet what ultimate kindness could there be in such delay? Life and death are but the counterparts of day and night. Catherine awoke with a touch of her husband's hand upon her cheek. She sighed, put out her arms to him, a consciousness of pain vivid at once upon her face. "You here?" She put her hands up to her forehead. "I never meant to sleep. What a long day you must have had." "It is better that I should work." "Yes." "How is she?" "The same. I can see no change." Catherine rose with a suggestion of effort, and leaned for a moment on her husband's arm. The impulse seemed simultaneous with them, the impulse that drew them to the room above. They went up together, hand in hand, silent and restrained, two souls awed by the mysteries of death and life. On the bed by the window lay Gwen, with childishly open, yet sightless eyes. A flush of vivid colour showed on either cheek, her golden hair falling aside like waves of light about her forehead. Her breathing was tranquil and feeble, and spaced out with a peculiar rhythm. The pupils of the eyes were markedly unequal, one lid drooped slightly, and the right angle of the red mouth was a little drawn. It is a certain pitiful semblance of health that mocks the heart in many such cases. Children who die thus are often beautiful. They seem to sleep with open eyes. The flush on the cheeks has nothing of the gathering greyness of death. Catherine, bending low, looked at Gwen with the long look of one who will not see the vanishing torch of hope. She is still asleep. Yes, asleep. The man's voice was a tearless echo. James, it can't be. Look, what a colour, and the eyes. Murchison laid a hand gently on her shoulder. I know. I have seen such things before. But she will wake presently. Presently. Yes, this long sleep will do her good. Murchison sighed. She will not wake for us, wife, he said. Not wake? Catherine's eyes were incredulous, full of the intentness of a mother's love. No, not here. But look at her. That is the pity of it. Then I shall not hear her speak again? She will never see me? Never. But why? I cannot believe... Dear, it is death. The way some children die. They stood silent, side by side. Then Catherine bent low. Child's mouth and mother's mouth met in a long dream kiss. There was a sound of broken, troubled whispering in the room, a sound of an inarticulate tenderness and wordless prayer. Murchison's right hand covered his face. His wife's eyes and cheeks were wet with tears. Kate! She bowed herself over the child and did not stir. No, no, these last hours, they are so precious. He looked at her mutely, put a hand to his throat, and turned away. It was too solemn, too poignant a scene for him to outrage it with words. Gwen, dead in life, would see her mother's face no more. Murchison was on the stairs when the blare of a tin trumpet seemed to hurt the silence of the little house. An impatient fist was beating a tattoo on the front door. It was the boy Jack home from school. Murchison's mouth quivered and then hardened. He went to the door and opened it to a blast of the boy's trumpet. "Hello, I say!" A strong hand twisted the toy from the boy's fingers. "Silence!" Jack Murchison's mouth gaped. He looked at his father's face, wonderingly, grievedly, and was awed into a frightened silence, child egoist that he was, by the expression in his father's eyes. Murchison pointed to the sitting-room door. "Go and sit down." The boy obeyed, sullen and a little stupefied. His father closed and locked the door on him, and then passed out into the space behind the house that they called a garden. A few crocuses were gilding the sour black earth. They were flowers that Gwen had planted before Christmas time, and Murchison, as he looked at them, thought that she should take them in her little hands to the great Father of all children. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Miss Carmagee sat crying at the breakfast table over a letter that she held in her fat white hand. It was a letter from Catherine, and told of the last resting place of Gwen, a narrow bed of clay amid white headstones on the Wilson Hills. She had been reading the letter aloud to her brother, whose face was a study in the irritable suppression of his feelings. "Damn that bird!" The canary in its cage by the window was filling the room with shivers of shrill sound. Porteus pushed his chair back, jerked an antimacassar from the sofa, and flung it over the bird's cage. "Go on, dear, go on. I am expecting Dixon to see me in 10 minutes." Miss Carmagee wiped her spectacles and blundered on brokenly through the letter. There were 8 pages, closely written, and whether it was the indistinctness of Catherine's writing or the dimness of Miss Carmagee's eyes, the old lady's progress was sluggish in the extreme. She had forgotten to add milk to her untasted cup of tea, and the rashers of bacon on her plate were congealing into unappetizing grease. Porteus sat fidgeting at the far end of the table. The vitality of his interest betrayed itself in a frowning and jerky spirit of impatience. "Well, what are they going to do now, eh? Stay on and lose the boy? Murchison ought to have more sense." Miss Carmagee's eyes had assumed an expression of moist surprise behind her spectacles. She appeared to be digesting some unexpected piece of news in silence, and with the amiable forgetfulness of a lethargic mind. Porteus had handed her his empty cup. Some seconds elapsed before his sister noticed the intrusion of the china. "Dear, what a coincidence!" She took the cup and filled it mechanically, her eyes still fixed upon the letter. "Well, what is it?" "If only it had happened earlier, the money would have been of use." Mr. Porteus betrayed the natural impatience of the energetic male. "Bless my soul! Are you contriving a monopoly?" Miss Carmagee lifted her mild spectacles to her brother's face. "Mrs. Pentherby is dead," she said. "Dead?" "Yes." "No extreme loss to the community. Ah, would you—" and he cast a threatening glance in the direction of the bird-cage at the sound of an insinuating tweet. "Well, what about the money?" The lawyer's eyes twinkled as though Mrs. Pentherby's dividends were more interesting than her person. "She has left nearly all her money and her furniture to Catherine. She died the very same day as Gwen." "Pity it wasn't 6 months ago. The old lady had some first-class china and a few fine pictures. Does Catherine say how much?" "How much what, Porteus?" "Money, my dear, money." "I don't think she says." Her brother pushed back his chair and glanced briskly at his watch. "I'll take it with me," he said, stretching out a brown and energetic hand for the letter. "I haven't quite finished it, Porteus." "Never mind. There's your breakfast getting cold. You had better have some fresh tea made." His sister surrendered the letter with a spirit of amiable self-negation. "The money ought to make a difference to them," she said softly, taking off her spectacles and wiping them with slow, pensive hands. "Money always makes a difference, my dear, especially when people are heroically proud." Miss Phyllis Carmagee's thoughts were towards that grey-skied, slaving, sordid town where Gwen was buried, as she sipped her tea and looked at her brother's empty chair. She was a woman whom many of her neighbours thought stolid and reserved, a woman not gifted with great powers of self-expression. Friendship with many is a mere gratification of the social ego. The vivacious people who delight in conversationalism take pleasure in those personalities that are new and pleasing for the moment, even as they are interested in new and complex flowers. To Phyllis Carmagee, however, her friends had more of the enduring dearness of familiar trees. They were part of her consciousness, part of her daily and her yearly life. Porteus's sister came by an idea as she sat alone at the breakfast-table that morning. Serene and obese natures are slow in conceiving, yet the concept may have the greater stability for the very slowness of the progress. The crystallization of that idea went on all day, till it was ready to be displayed in its completeness to her brother as he dined. Miss Carmagee had decided to go down to Wilton, and to show that her friendship was worth a long day's journey. A sentimental and unctuous letter would have sufficed for a mere worldling, but Porteus Carmagee's sister had that rare habit of being loyal and sincere. "I should like to see the child's grave," she said quietly. her round, white face very soft and gentle in the light of the shaded lamp. "It seems hard to realize that the little thing is dead. Gwen meant so much to her father. I wonder what they are going to do." Porteus Carmagee stared hard at the silver epergne full of daffodils before him on the table. They were at dessert and alone, with the curtains drawn and a wood fire burning in the old-fashioned grate. The whole setting of the room spoke of a generation that was past. It suggested solidity and repose, placid kindliness, prosaic comfort. "Murchison ought never to have left us," said the lawyer, curtly. "No." "The affair might have blown over in a year." "You think so, Porteus?" "If he had only stuck to his guns. People always wait to see what a man will do. If he skedaddles, they draw their own inferences. Life is largely a game of bluff." The eyes of brother and sister met in a sudden, questioning glance. Possibly the same thought had occurred to both. Would it be possible? Possible for what? For James Murchison to come back to Roxton. The lawyer reached for his napkin that had slipped down from his knees. "That is the question," he confessed. "It is not easy to rebuild a reputation. I would rather face fire than the sneers of my genteel neighbours." Miss Carmagee's placid face had lost its habitual air of contentment and repose. "I know it would require courage," she said. "People would probably call it impertinence. It requires more than courage to be successfully impertinent in this world." "Cleverness, Porteus?" "Genius. The genius of patience, magnanimity, and self-restraint." His sister pondered a moment, while Porteus sipped his port. "Then there is Catherine." Her brother's keen eye lit up at the name. "Ah, there we have a touch of the divine fire." "She could help him." "Next to God." There was silence again between them for a season. The dim and homely room seemed full of a quiet dignity, a pervading restfulness that was clean and good. The most prosaic people grow great and lovable when their hearts are moved to succor others. The words of a beggar may strike the noblest chords of time, and live with the utterances of martyrs and of prophets. "Porteus," brother and sister looked at each other, "I might speak to them." "Perhaps, dear, better than any one." "And if they need money? Mrs. Pentherby's property cannot come to them at once. The law—" Porteus's face twinkled benignantly. "The law, like a mule, is abominably slow. If I can be of any use to them— Remind Kate that I am still alive." Miss Carmagee regarded her brother affectionately across the table. "Then I shall go to-morrow," she said, with a quiet sigh. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. An increased sallowness and a slight thinning of the hair were the only changes that might have been noticed in Parker Steel that spring. The characteristic symptoms had been slight and evanescent, the rash so faint and transient that a delicate dusting of powder had hidden it even from Mrs. Betty's eyes. A few of his most intimate friends had noticed that Parker Steel had the tense, strained look of a man suffering from overwork. That he had given up his nightly cigar and his wine pointed also to the fact that the physician had knowledge of his own needs. To such a man as Steele the zest of life lay in the energetic stir and ostentatious bustle of success. His conceit was in his cleverness, in the smartness of his equipage and reputation, and in the flattering gossip that haunts a healer's name. Parker Steel was essentially a selfish mortal, and selfish men are often the happiest provided they succeed. Yet no man, however selfish, can wholly stifle his own thoughts. That the silence he kept was an immoral silence no man knew better than did Parker Steel. People would have shrunk from him had they known the truth, as a refined woman shrinks from the offensive carcass of a drunken tramp. His own niceness of taste revolted from the consciousness of chance and undeserved pollution. Ambition was strong in him, however, and the cold tenacity to hold what he had gained. More isolated than Selkirk on his island, he had to bear the bitterness of it alone, knowing that sympathy was locked out by silence. The supreme trying of his powers of hypocrisy came for him in his attitude towards his wife. Parker Steel was in no sense an uxorious fellow, and neither he nor Betty were ever demonstrative towards each other. An occasional half-perfunctory meeting of the lips had satisfied both after the first year of marriage. For this reason Parker Steel's ordeal was less complex and severe than if he had had to repulse an emotional and warm-blooded woman. The first diplomatic development had been insomnia. At least, that was the excuse he made to Betty when he chose to sleep alone in his dressing-room at the back of the house. The faintest sound disturbed him, so he protested, and the rattle of wheels over the cobbles of the square kept him irritably sleepless in the early hours of the morning. To Betty Steele there was no inconsistency in the excuse he gave. She thought him worried and overworked, and there was abundant justification for the latter evil. Winter and early spring are the briskest seasons of a doctor's life. Dr. Steele had had 7 severe cases of pneumonia on his list 1 week. "You are too much in demand, Parker," she had said. "There is always the possibility of a partner to be considered." "Thanks, no. I am not a believer in a cooperative business." "You must take a jaunt somewhere as soon as the work slackens." "All in good time, dear." "Sicily is fashionable." Parker Steel had indulged in optimistic reflections to distract her vigilance. She had sought to prove that he was in stale health by remarking that the wound on his forefinger had not completely healed. He was still wearing the finger-stall that covered the Forze Origo Mali. "There is absolutely no need for you to fuss about me," he had answered. "I am not made of iron, and the work tells. 3,000 a year is not earned without worry." "As much as that, Parker?" He had touched a susceptible passion in her. "Perhaps more. We shall be able to call our own tune before we are 45. "Heaven defend us, Parker! You hint at terrible things. Respectable obesity and morning prayers." Her husband had laughed, and given her plausible comfort. "You will be more dangerous then than you are now," he had said. In truth, their fortunes were very much in the ascendant, and the social side of professional life had prospered in Mrs. Betty's hands. The brunette was supreme in Roxton so far as beauty was concerned, supreme also in the yet more magic elements of graceful savoir-faire and tact. She was one of those women who had learned to charm by flattery without seeming to be a sycophant. Moreover, she had tested the wisdom of propitiating her own sex by appearing even more amiable to women than to men. Since the passing of the Murchisons she had had nothing in the way of rivalry to fear. True, 2 miserable squatters had put up brass plates in the town and scrambled for some of the poorer of James Murchison's patients. Mrs. Betty had been able to call upon the wives with patronizing magnanimity. They were both rather dusty, round-backed ladies, with no pretensions to style, either in their own persons or in the persons of their husbands. One of these professional gentlemen, a huge and flat-faced Paddy, resembled a police constable in plain clothes. The other was rather a meek young man in glasses, destitute in any sense of humour, and very useful in the Sunday school. Roxton had weathered Lent and Easter, and Lady Sophia Gillingham, Dame President of the local habitation of the Primrose League, patroness of all Roxton charities, dissenting enterprises excepted, the late lady-in-waiting to the Queen, had called her many dear friends together to discuss the coming Midsummer Bazaar that was held annually for the benefit of the Roxton Cottage Hospital. Roxton, like the majority of small country towns, was a veritable complexity of cliques, and by Roxton should be understood the superior people, who were Unionists in politics, and Church Christians in religion. There were also chapel Christians in Roxton, chiefly of radical persuasion, and therefore hardly decent in the sight of the genteel. People of peculiar views were rare, and not generally encouraged. Some of the orthodox even refused to buy a local tradesman's boots, because that particular tradesman was not a believer in the Trinity. The inference is obvious that the Roxton concerned in Lady Sophia's charitable bazaar was superior and highly cultured Roxton, the Roxton of dinner jackets and distinction, equipages and debrette. To be a very dear friend of Lady Sophia Gillingham's was to be one of the chosen and elect of God, and Betty Steele had come by that supreme and angelic exaltation. Perhaps Mignon's kitten had purred and gambolled Mrs. Betty into favour. More probably the physician's wife had nothing to learn from any cat. Betty Steele and her husband dined frequently at Roxton Priory. The brunette had even reached the unique felicity of being encouraged in informal and unexpected calls. Lady Sophia possessed a just and proper estimate of her own social position. She was fat, commonplace, and amiable, poorly educated, a woman of few ideas. But she was Lady Sophia Gillingham, and would have expected St. Peter to give her proper precedence over mere commoners in the anteroom of heaven. The third Thursday after Easter, Mrs. Betty Steele drove homeward in a radiant mood, with a spirit of spring stolen from the dull glint of the fat old lady's eyes. There had been an opening committee meeting, and Lady Sophia had expressed it to be her wish that Mrs. Steele should be elected secretary. Moreover, the production of a play had been discussed, a pink muslin drama suited to the susceptibilities of the Anglican public. The part of heroine had been offered, not unanimously, to Mrs. Betty, and with a becoming spirit of diffidence she had accepted the honour, when pressed most graciously by the Lady Sophia's own prosings. Mrs. Betty might have impersonated April as she swept homeward under the high beneficence of St. Antonia's elms. The warmth of worldly well-being plumps out a woman's comeliness. She expands and ripens in the sun of prosperity and praise, in contrast to the thousands of ever-contriving poor, whose sordid faces are but the reflection of sordid facts. Betty Steele's face had an April alluringness that day. Its outlines were soft and beautiful, suggestive of the delicacy of apple bloom seen through morning mist. She was exceeding well content with life, was Mrs. Betty, for her husband was in a position to write generous cheques, and the people of Roxton seemed ready to pay her homage. Parker Steele was reading in the dining-room when this triumphant and happy lady came in like a white flower rising from a sheath of green. It was only when selfishly elated that the wife showed any flow of affection for her husband. For the once she had the air of an enthusiastic girl whom marriage had not robbed of her ideals. "Dear old Parker!" She went towards him with an outstretching of the hands as he dropped the Morning Post and half rose from the lounge-chair. "Had a good time?" "Quite splendid." She swooped towards him, not noticing the furtive yet watchful expression in her husband's face. "Give me a kiss, old Morning Post." "How is Madame Sophia?" "Most affable." Parker Steele had caught her outstretched hands. It was as though he were afraid of touching his wife's lips. "Making conquests, eh?" "Wa'al, I guess that," and she spoke through her nose. "Dollars?" "Enticing them into the family pocket." Something in her husband's eyes touched Betty Steele beneath her vivacity and easy persiflage. Her husband had risen from his chair, released her hands, and moved away towards the fire. She had a sudden instinct telling her that he was not glad of her return. The wife's airiness was damped instantly. Parker Steele had repelled her, with the semi-playful air of a man not wishing to be bothered. She had noticed this suggestion of aloofness much in him of late, and had ascribed it to irritability, the result of overwork. "Anything the matter, dear?" "Matter?" He looked at her frankly, with arched brows and open eyes. "Yes, you seem tired." "There is some excuse for me. This is the first 10 minutes I have had to myself all day. It is an effort to talk when one's tongue has been going for hours." His wife's face appeared a little triste and peevish. She glanced at herself in the mirror over the mantelpiece, and found herself wondering why life seemed composed of actions and reactions. "Have you had tea?" "No, I waited." And he turned and rang the bell with a feeling of relief. It was trying to his watchfulness for Parker Steel to be left alone with his own wife. Even the white cap of the parlour-maid was welcome to him, or the flimsiest barrier that could aid him in his ordeal of silent isolation. The art of hypocrisy grows more complex with each new statement of relationships, and hypocrisy in the home is the regilding of a substance that tarnishes with every day. The wear and tear of life erase the lying surface, and the daily daubing becomes a habit by necessity, even as a single dyeing of the hair pledges the vain mortal to perpetual self-decoration. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. There were many men in Wilton who had looked at their children's graves, little banks of green turf ranged on the hillside where the winds wailed in winter, like the mythical spirits of the damned. A gaunt, graceless place, this cemetery, a place where the insignificant dead lived only in the few notches of a mason's chisel upon stone. A high yellow brick wall encompassed its many acres. Immediately within the iron gates stood a tin chapel, a building that might have stood for the Temple of Ugliness, the deity of commercialized towns. On either side of the main walk a row of sickly aspens lifted their slender branches against a hueless sky. To the man and the woman who stood in one corner of this burial ground, looking down upon a grave that had been but lately banked with turf, there was an infinite and sordid sadness in the scene. 2 graves, not 10 yards away, had been filled in but the day before, and the grass was caked and stained with yellow clay. Near them stood the black wooden shelter used by the officiating priest in dirty weather. A few wreaths, sodden, rain-drenched, the flowers already turning brown, seemed to mock the hands that had placed them there. White headstones everywhere, a few obelisks, a few plain wooden crosses, rank mounds where no name lingered after death. Ever and again the thin clink of the hopeless chapel bell. A grey sky merging into a wet grey landscape. In the valley, Wilton, prostrate under the mist and smoke. James Murchison, standing bareheaded before Gwen's grave, gazed at the wet turf with the eyes of a man who saw more beneath it than mere lifeless clay. There was nothing of rebellion in the pose of the tall figure, rather the slight stoop of one poring over some rare book with the reverence of him who reads to learn. For Catherine there was no consciousness of penance as she stood beside him, silent and distant-eyed. Her hands were clasped together under her cloak. She stood as one waiting, heart heavy, yet ready to awake to the new life that opens even for those who grieve. There were not a few such groups scattered about this upland burial-ground, colourless, subdued figures, seen dimly through the drizzling mist of rain. Quite near to Murchison, a working man was arranging a few flowers in a large white jam-pot. The grave, by the name on the headstone, was the grave of his wife. A few children, who had wandered up to see some funeral, were playing touch wood between the aspens of the main walk. There was an irresponsible callousness in their shrill, slum-hardened voices. To them, this place of death was but a field to play in. Murchison had turned from Gwen's grave and was looking at his wife. There seemed some bond more sacred between them now that they had shared both life and death in the body of their child. "You are cold, dear." He touched her cheek with his hand as he turned up the collar of her cloak. Her hair was wet and a-glisten with the rain, her face cold like the face of one fresh from the breath of an autumn sea. "Only my skin. The wind is keen, though. It is time we turned back home." "Yes." "Good-bye, my child." He spoke the words in a whisper as they moved away from the corner. Before them, seen dimly through a haze of rain, lay the colliery town, a vague splash of darkness in the valley. Here and there a tall chimney stood trailing smoke, or the faint glow of a fire gave a thin opalescence to the shell of mist. Sounds, faint and far, yet full in the significance of labour, drifted up the bleak slopes of the hillside, like the sounds from ships sailing a foggy sea. The rattle of a train, the shriek of a steam whistle, the slow strokes of some great clock striking the hour. James Murchison's eyes were fixed upon this town beside the pit mouths, this pool of poverty and toil, where the eddies of effort never ceased upon the surface. It was strange to him, this colliery town, and yet familiar. Always would his manhood yearn towards it because of the dear dead, even though its memories were hateful to him, full of the bitterness of ignominy and pain. Gwen's death had come to Murchison as a sudden silence, a strange void in the hurrying entities of life. It was as though the passing of this child had changed the phenomena of existence for him, and given a new rhythm to the pulse of time. He had become aware of a new setting to life, even as a man who has walked the same road day by day discovers on some winter dawn a fresh and unearthly beauty in the scene. He felt an unsolved newness in his being, a solemnity such as those who have looked upon the dead must feel. And no strong nature can pass through such a phase without creating inward energy and power. Sorrow, like winter, may be but a season of repose, troubled and drear perhaps, but moving towards the miracle of spring. Wilton Cemetery, with its zinc-roofed chapel, its yellow walls and iron gates, lay behind them, while the dim horizon ran in a grey blur along the hills. Husband and wife walked for a time in silence, for each had a burden of deep thought to bear. It was the man who spoke first, quietly and with restraint, and yet with something of the fierce spirit of an outcast Cain visible upon his face. "I have been thinking of what I said to you last night." She was looking at him with a brave clearness of the eyes. "I suppose sensible people would call such a venture mad." "We are often strongest, dear, when we are most mad." He swung on beside her, his eyes at gaze. "The madness of a forlorn hope. No, it is not that. I have not any of the impudence of the adventurer. It is something more solemn, more grim, more for a final end." "Beloved, I understand." "Are you not afraid for me?" "No, no." She put her hand under his arm. "God give us both courage, dear," she said. They had reached the outskirts of Wilton, and the ugliness of the place was less visible in these outworks of the town. The streets had something of the quaintness of antiquity about them, for this was a part of the real Wilton, an old English townlet that had been gripped and strangled by the decapod of the pits. "About your mother's money, Kate." The rumble of a passing van compelled silence for a moment. "You must retain the whole control." "I?" "Yes." He heard a woman's unwillingness in her voice. "It is my wish, dear. I shall need a certain sum to start with, but my life insurance can be made a security for that." "James!" Her face reproached him. Are we so little married that what is mine is not yours also? It is because you are my wife, Kate, that I consider these things. Your mother was wise, though her instructions do not flatter me. Legally, I cannot touch a single penny." She looked troubled and a little impatient. "I shall hate the money no, I don't mean that. But, dear," and she drew very close to him in the twilight of the streets, "it will make no difference. You will not feel—" "Feel, Kate?" "That it is mine and not yours. You know, dear, what I mean. I don't want to think that you will feel as though you had to ask." They looked, man and wife, into each other's eyes. "I shall ask, Kate, because—" "Because?" "You are what you are. It will not hurt me to remember that the stuff is yours." Now, quite an hour ago, a battered and moth-eaten cab had deposited a stout lady on the doorstep of Clovelly. The stout lady had a round white face that beamed sympathetically from under the arch of a rather grotesque bonnet. A girl, hired for the month, and dressed in a makeshift black frock, had opened the door 3 inches to Miss Carmagee. There had been a confidential discussion between these two, the girl letting the gap between the door and door-post increase before the lady in the grotesque bonnet. The doctor and the missus were out, and Master Jack having tea at a friend's house in the next street. So much Miss Carmagee had learned before she had been admitted to the little front room. It was quite dusk when Catherine and her husband turned in at the garden gate. The blinds were down, the gas lit. Murchison opened the front door with his key, remembering, as he ever remembered, the golden head that would shine no more for him in that diminutive, dreary house. He was hanging his coat on a peg in the passage when he heard a sharp cry from Catherine, who had entered the front room. There was the rustling of skirts, the sound of an inarticulate greeting between 2 eager friends. No one could have doubted Miss Carmagee's solid identity. She was resting her hands on Catherine's shoulders. They had kissed each other like mother and child. "Why, when did you come? We had no letter. James! James!" Murchison found them holding hands. There were tears in Miss Carmagee's mild blue eyes. Warned of her coming, he might have shirked the meeting with the pride of a man too sensitive towards the past. But Miss Carmagee in the flesh, motherly and very gentle, with Catherine's kisses warm upon her face, stood for nothing that was critical or chilling to the heart. He met her with open hands. "You have taken us by surprise." Miss Phyllis's eyes were on the sad, memory-shadowed face. "I had to come," and her voice failed her a little. "I shan't worry you. We are old friends." She put up her benign and ugly face as though the privilege of a mother belonged to her by nature. "I have felt it all so much." A flash of infinite yearning leaped up and passed in the man's eyes. "You must be tired," he said, clinging to commonplaces. "Have they sent your luggage up?" Miss Carmagee sank into a chair. "I left it at the hotel. I am not going to be a worry." "Worry? Of course not, child." "Oh, but we must have you here. James?" "My dear," and the substantial nature of the old lady's person seemed to become evident, "I insist on sleeping there to-night. Now, humour me, or I shall feel myself a nuisance." Miss Carmagee's solidity of will made her contention impregnable. Moreover, the common-sense view she took of the matter boasted a large element of discretion. People who live in a small house on £160 a year cannot be expected to be prepared for social emergencies. Even a philosopher is limited by the contents of his larder, and Miss Carmagee was one of those excellent women whose philosophy takes note of the trivial things of life: pots, pans, and linen, the cold end of mutton, the rice pudding to supply 3. It is truly regrettable that a man's Promethean spirit should be bound down by such contemptible trifles. Yet a tactful refusal to share a suet pudding may be worth more than the wittiest epigram ever made. Miss Carmagee and Catherine spent an hour alone together that evening, for Murchison had patients waiting for him at Dr. Tugler's surgery in Wilton High Street. Master Jack had returned from his tea party to be hugged, presented with a box of soldiers, a clasp knife, and a prayer book, and then hurried off to bed. The soldiers and the knife shared the sheets with him. The prayer book, amiable aunts forgive, was left derelict under an armchair. But the great event that night for these two women, such contrasts and yet so alike in the deeper things of the soul, came with that communing together before the fire, the lights turned low, the room in shadow. It was some while before Miss Carmagee approached the purpose that had brought her across England with bag and baggage. She was a woman of tact, and it is not easy to be a partisan at times without wounding those whom we wish to help. The elder woman had hardly broached the subject before Catherine, sitting on a cushion beside Miss Carmagee's chair, turned from the firelight with an eager lifting of the head. "Why, it was only yesterday that James spoke to me of such a plan." "To return to us?" "Yes, and win back what he lost." Miss Carmagee saw her way more clearly. "You know, child, you have many friends." "I?" "Yes, and your husband also. Porteus and I discussed the matter. You must not think us busybodies, dear." A kiss was the surest answer. "I was afraid when James first spoke of it." "Afraid?" "Yes," and she coloured. "It was cowardly of me, but I remembered how we left the place. It will be an ordeal. We shall have to walk through fire together. But still—" "Well, child," and Miss Carmagee let her have her say. "Still, there is a greatness in the plan that takes my heart. We women love our husbands to be brave. I know what it will mean to James. He says that many people will think him mad." Miss Carmagee sat stroking one of Catherine's hands. "It is the right kind of madness," she said softly. "To rise above public opinion? Yes, when we are in the right." They sat for a while in silence, looking into the fire, Catherine's head against Miss Carmagee's shoulder. Above, in the nursery, Jack Murchison was trying his new knife on the rail of a bedroom chair. He had crept out of bed, rummaged up some matches, and lit the gas. The boy had no eyes for the empty cot in the far corner of the room. He had not yet grasped what the loss of a life in the home meant. "I want you to promise me something, dear." Miss Carmagee's hand touched the mother's hair. "Yes?" "I want you to tell me frankly about the money." Catherine looked up into the benign white face. "You mean—" "I mean, dear, that there is a lot of dusting and polishing to be done before the lawyers allow people to step into their own shoes. I have a pair that I could lend you for a year or so." Catherine smiled at the simile, despite the occasion. Miss Carmagee's shoes were as large and generous as her heart. "It is too good of you. They tell me I have inherited property that will bring in an income of 700 to 800 a year. I don't think—" "Well?" "That we could let you be so generous." Miss Carmagee leaned forward in her chair. "Generous? It is not generous, dear. A mere matter of convenience." "You call it merely convenience?" "No, child, I ought to call it a blessing to me, a true blessing. Don't you understand that it would make me very happy?" "Yes, I understand." "That's right." "How good and kind you are." "Nonsense, dear, nonsense." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Mr. Gehogan, a gentleman from Ireland, who had attempted to possess himself of the scatterings of James Murchison's practice, had discovered no proper spirit of appreciation in Roxton, and as though to register his displeasure, had departed abruptly, so abruptly that he had left behind him many unpaid bills. The house in Lombard Street had held him and his progeny for some seasons, and the family had left its mark upon the place in more instances than one. Miss Carmagee and her brother, who went over the house for some unexplained reason, concluded that clean paint and paper, and many scrubbings with soap and water, were needed for the effacement of an atmosphere of mediaeval sanctity. The charwoman averred, an excellent authority, that the late tenant had kept pigs in a shed at the end of the garden, and had salted and stored the bacon in the bath. The house itself had been left littered with all sorts of rubbish. Dr. Gehogan's youngsters had turned the back garden into a species of pleasance by the sea. There was a big puddle in the middle of the lawn, and oyster shells, broken bricks, and jam jars had accumulated to an extraordinary extent. About the end of April, such people of observation as passed down Lombard Street discovered that the great red brick house was preparing for new tenants. Mr. Clayton, the decorator, had hung his professional board from the central first-floor window. Sashes were being repainted white, the front door an aesthetic green. Paper-hangers were at work in the chief rooms, and whitewash brushes splashed and flapped in the kitchen quarters. Questioned by interested fellow tradesmen as to the name and nature of the incoming tenant, Mr. Clayton blinked and confessed his ignorance. He was working under Mr. Porteus Carmagee's orders. Mr. Clayton had never even heard that the house had changed hands, and that the lawyer had bought it from the late owner, but whether it was let, Mr. Clayton could not tell. Even Mr. Beasley, the local house-agent, was no wiser in the matter. Speculation remained possible, while the more pushing of the local tradesmen were ready at any moment to tout for the newcomer's esteemed patronage. One afternoon early in May, a large furniture van, manoeuvring to and fro in Lombard Street, and absorbing the whole road, compelled a stylish carriage and pair to come to a sharp halt. The carriage was Dr. Parker Steele's, and it contained his wife, a complacent study in pink, with the pert little white hat perched on a most elaborate yet seemingly simple coiffure. The footway opposite the Murchison's old house was littered with straw and stray odds and ends of furniture, while two men in green baize aprons were struggling up the steps with a Chesterfield sofa. Through one of the open windows of the dining-room, Betty Steele's sharp eyes caught sight of Miss Carmagee, rigged up in a white apron and unpacking china with the help of one of her maids. The furniture van had made port, and Parker Steele's carriage rolled on into St. Antonia's Square. Mrs. Betty's eyes had clouded a little under her Paris hat, for unpleasant thoughts are invariably suggested by the faces of people who do not love us. The ego in self-conscious mortals is sensitive as a piece of smoked glass. The passing of the faintest shadow is registered upon its surface, and its lustre may be dimmed by a chance breath. This house in Lombard Street had never lost for Betty its suggestion of passive hostility. Its associations always stirred the energies of an unforgotten hate, and though triumphant, she often found herself frowning when she passed the place. Moreover, Miss Carmagee had been the other woman's friend, and in life there can be no neutrality when rivals fight for survival in the business of success. Betty Steele had come from the orchards that were white about Roxton Priory, yet the glimpse of the stir and movement in that red brick house had blown the May bloom from her thoughts. Did Kate Murchison ever wish herself back in Lombard Street? What had become of her and her children? Betty Steele woke from a moment's reverie as the carriage drew up before her own home. The elderly parlour-maid, 5 feet of starch, to say nothing of the cap, opened the front door to Mrs. Betty. There was an inquisitive lift about the woman's eyelids, and Betty Steele, an expert in the deciphering of faces, expected news of some sort or another. "Anyone in the drawing-room, Simons?" "No, ma'am." "Well?" "Dr. Steele is in the study. He wished me to say that he would see you the moment you came home." Nearly 24 hours had passed since Betty Steele had seen her husband. The physician had been called up in the night, and had breakfasted away. She herself had lunched with Lady Gillingham, so that their paths had run uncrossed since yesterday. "Has any one called?" "No, ma'am." "You may bring up tea." The Venetian blinds were down in the consulting room, an initial coincidence, for Parker Steel was a believer in light. He was sitting at the bureau by the window, but glanced over his shoulder as his wife entered. "Is that you, dear?" "Yes, what is it?" She was playing with her silk scarf, and looking with rather a puzzled air at her husband. "I've just sent off a wire to town." "A wire?" "Yes, to Turner, for a first-class locum. The man will be here early to-morrow. Shut the door, dear, shut the door." There was an irritable harshness of voice and a jerkiness of manner that betrayed unusual lack of self-control. Her husband's back was half turned to her, and he was scribbling on a sheet of paper that he had before him, but she could see the frown upon his forehead and the nervous working of his lips. "What is the matter, Parker?" "Oh, nothing serious. Only one of your prophecies come home to roost." "My prophecies?" "Yes, about overwork. I was a fool not to knock off earlier. Some inflammatory trouble in my eyes." "Eyes?" She echoed the word, showing for the first time some stirrings of alarm. "What is it?" "Strain, nothing more. It came on quite suddenly. I shall have to have a month's absolute rest." He leaned back and put a hand up to his forehead. "Let me look." Betty went to him and leaned her hands upon the side rail of his chair. "You won't make much of them. See, I'm just writing out a few hints and directions." "They look inflamed, Parker." He shrugged impatiently. "Don't bother about the eyes. See, I want you to give these notes to Turner's locum when he comes. The list is complete, with a cross against the more important people. The work's lighter again. He can manage it alone." "Yes," but she still looked troubled. "I shall get away by the 10:15 tomorrow morning." "Where are you going?" "Oh, to Torquay. I've wired to a hotel. Ramsden is doing eye work down there, you know. He will soon put me right." Betty stood with her hands resting on the back of his chair. His assurances had not wholly satisfied her. She had a vague feeling that he was keeping something back. "Parker?" "Yes, dear." He appeared busy, dashing down professional hieroglyphics on the paper before him. "You are not keeping anything from me?" "Anything from you?" "Yes. It is nothing dangerous." "My dear girl, I ought to know." She sighed, looked at the darkened window, and then, stooping suddenly, kissed him softly on the cheek. "Parker." He had reddened and drawn aside, with an irritable knitting of the brows. "Leave me alone, dear, for a while. I want to put the practice in order." Repulsed, she removed her hands from the chair. "I was only anxious." "Don't worry, there's no cause. You will stay here and look after things for me?" "Yes, I can have Madge to stay." "And Betty?" "Yes. Don't say much about the eyes. It doesn't do for a professional man to get a reputation for feebleness in his physical equipment." "I shall not say anything." "Thanks. You see, I'm rather busy." She turned, looked round the room vaguely, her face cold and empty of any marked expression. Then she went slowly to the door, opened it, and passed out into the hall. The house seemed peculiarly dim and lonely as she climbed the stairs to her own room. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. "Goodbye, Mrs. Murchison. Goodbye, old man. Wish you could have stayed with us. Shake hands, sonny, now you're off." A barrow-load of belated luggage went clattering by as the shrill pipe of the guard's whistle sounded the departure. On the opposite platform a couple of porters were banging empty milk cans onto a truck. Yet from the noise and turmoil of it all, John Tugler's red face shone out with a redeeming exuberance of goodwill. Goodbye. Murchison was leaning from the window, and the two men shook hands. "Good luck to you." Thanks. You have been very good to us. We shall not forget it." "Bosh, man, bosh!" And John Tugler gave Catherine a final flourish of his hat. The train was on the move, but Murchison still leaned from the window, to the exclusion of his excited and irrepressible son. We grow fond of people who have stood by us in trouble, and John Tugler, bumptious and money-making mortal that he was, carried many generous impulses under his gorgeous waistcoat. The gift of sympathy covers a multitude of imperfections, for the heart craves bread and wine from others, and not the philosopher's stone. Interminable barriers of brick, backyards, sour, rubbish-ridden gardens were gliding by. Factories with their tall chimneys, the minarets of labour, stood out above the crowded greyness of the monotonous streets. Hardly a tree, and not an acre of green grass in Wilton. It was as though nature had cursed the place, and left it no symbol of the season, no passing pageantry of summer, autumn, or of spring. Catherine had kept Jack by her side, and the boy was kneeling on the seat and looking out of the window. She felt that her husband was in no mood for the child's chattering. In leaving Wilton, he was leaving a poignant part of reality behind, to enter upon a life that should try the strength of his manhood as a bowman tries a bow. An old lady and a consumptive clerk were their only fellow-travellers. Murchison had chosen a corner whose window looked towards the west, and an intense and determined face it was that stared out over the ugliness of Wilton town. Houses had given place to market gardens, acres of cabbages, flat, dismal, and dotted with zinc-roofed sheds. Beyond came the slow, sad heave of the Wilton hills, and seen dimly, white specks upon the hillside, the crowded headstones where the dead slept. The eyes of husband and wife met for a moment. They smiled at each other with the wistful cheerfulness of two people who have determined to be brave, a pathetic pretence hardly created to deceive. Moroseness need not testify deep feeling. The gleam from between the clouds turns even the wet clouds to gold. Jack Murchison was watching a couple of colts cantering across the field beside the line. "Mother, look at the old horses." "Yes, dear." "Silly old things. They're making that old cow run. The brown one's like Wellington, the horse we had before Dad bought the car." "So it is, dear." "Perhaps it is Wellington." "No, dear, Wellington must be dead by now." The old lady in the opposing corner was looking at Jack over her spectacles, and the boy took to returning the stare with the inimitable composure of youth. Catherine had turned again towards the other window, but the white headstones no longer checkered the hillside. Instead, she saw her husband's profile, stern and determined, yet infinitely sad. Life has been described as a series of sensations, and though some days are dull and passionless, others vibrate with 1,000 waves of feeling. To Murchison the day had been crowded with sensation since the break of dawn. It was a day of disruption, a plucking up of routine from the soil, a change of attitude that concerned the soul even more than the body. He yearned towards Wilton, and yet fled from it with gratitude. His old home called to him, and yet he dreaded it, as a disgraced man might fear the shocked faces of familiar friends. It was a day of unrest, self-judgment, and great forethought for him. The physical atoms seemed to tremble and vibrate, till the manhood in him might have been likened to a tremulous vapour. He could eat nothing, fix his mind on nothing. Even the sagging wires, coming and going as the train swept from pole to pole, were not unsymbolic of his thoughts. 200 miles, with an hour's wait in London, and the monotonous Midlands, gave place to the more mysterious and dreamy south. Pine-crowned hills, great oaks, and beeches purpling the villages, the blue distance of a more magical horizon. In orchards and meadows the infinite glamour of a golden spring. Quiet rivers curling through the mists of green. In many a park the stately spruce built sombre, endless thickets. Larches glimmered with Scotch firs, red-throated towards the west. Trees in whispering and triumphant multitudes, quiet, dreamy meadows where the willows waved, mysterious isles of Avalon imaginable towards the setting sun. Murchison, leaning back in his corner, watched for the pine woods about Roxton town with a deep commingling of yearning and of dread. It was to be a home-coming, and yet what a home-coming! The return of a prodigal, but no cringing prodigal. The return of a man, stiff-necked and square-jawed, ready to fight, but not to conciliate. There was something of the tense expectancy of the hour before the bugles blow the assault. Every nerve in Murchison's body tingled. The boy Jack was jumping from foot to foot at the other window. "Look, mother, look! There's old Mr. Tompkins's farm. And there's the river. Look, and the kingcups are out. Gwen used to call 'em—" He stopped suddenly, for his mother had drawn him to her and smothered the words with her mouth. "You take care of the rugs and umbrellas, dear." "Yes, shall I get 'em down?" "In a minute. Sit still, dear, and don't worry." She looked across quickly at her husband. Their eyes met. He was pale, but he smiled at her. "Here we are at last." At last. Both felt that the ordeal had begun. They let the boy lean out of the open window as the train ran in and slowed up beside the platform. Porteus Carmagee and his sister were waiting by the door of the booking office. Jack sighted them and waved a salute, their coach running far beyond the office, for they were in the forepart of the train. Murchison was the first out of the carriage. He lifted the boy down and stood waiting to help his wife with some of her parcels. "Luggage, sir?" Murchison turned and stared straight into the face of one of his old patients. The man looked at him blankly for a moment before recognition dawned upon his face. "Good day, doctor. Didn't know you, sir, at first," and he touched his cap. Murchison's upper lip was stiff. He looked like one who had come to judge rather than to be judged. "Get my luggage out, Johnson. 3 trunks, a Gladstone hat-box, and 2 wooden cases." "Yes, sir." The man was polite, though ready to be inquisitive. "Glad to see you again in Roxton, sir." "Thanks." "Cab, sir? There's Timmins's fly." "Yes, that will do." Murchison turned abruptly from the porter to find Miss Carmagee and Catherine kissing, and Jack tugging at his godfather's hands. It was Porteus in a new Panama hat, whose whiteness made his face look brown as an Asiatic's. "Ah, my dear Murchison, 10 minutes late. Beast of a line, this." "It was good of you to come." "Eh, what? Not a bit of it. Where's your luggage? I abhor stations. Can't talk in comfort. This imp of darkness can come along with us." An unprejudiced observer would have imagined the little man in the most peppery of tempers. He tweaked Jack by the ear, frowned hard at Catherine, and bit his moustache as though possessed by some uncontrollable spirit of impatience. His sister was straightening her bonnet strings. "You can drive straight home, dear. Everything is ready." "You don't know how much I feel all this." "There, you must be tired. We are going to take the boy tonight." Miss Carmagee's stout figure seemed to stand like a breakwater between Catherine and the world, and there was an all-sufficing courage on her face. People were staring. Murchison became aware of it as they moved towards the booking office. Several familiar faces seemed to start up vividly out of the past. He noticed 2 porters grinning and talking together beside a pile of luggage near the bridge, and his sensitive pride concluded that they were making him their mark. The ticket collector was a thin, grey-headed man whom Murchison had known for years. He found himself conjecturing, as one conjectures over trifles at such a pass, whether the man would remember him or not. The official received the tickets without vouchsafing a glimmer of recognition, but he stared after Murchison when he had passed, with that curious peering insolence typical of the breed. Outside the station, a very throaty individual in a very big cap, Harris tweed suit, white stock, and mulberry red waistcoat, was giving instructions to a porter with regard to a barrow-load of luggage. A trim dog-cart stood by the curb, with a sleek little woman in a tailor-made costume perched on the seat, and looking down on everybody with something of the keenness of a hawk. It so happened that this exquisite piece of breeding, this Colonel Larter of country fame, stepped back against Murchison in turning towards his dog-cart. "Beg pardon." The words were reinforced by a surprised and rather impertinent stare. "What?" "Don't trouble to mention it, sir." "How do you do? Had heard you were knocking about down our way. Wife well?" Colonel Larter's glance had passed the figure in black, and had fixed itself on the Carmagees and Catherine. There is always some charm about a handsome woman that can command courtesy, and Colonel Larter walked round Murchison with the sang-froid of a superior person, and ignored the husband in appearing impressive to the wife. "How d'ye do, Mrs. Murchison? Back in Roxton? Miss Carmagee has been keeping secrets from us. Quite a crime, I'm sure." Catherine had seen the slighting of her husband. "We are back again, Colonel Larter." "That's good. To stay?" And he nodded affably to the lawyer. "Yes, to stay." "And the piccaninnies? Hullo, here's one of them. And where's my little flirt? What, left her behind?" Colonel Larter had one of those high-pitched, patronizing voices that carry a goodly distance and allow casual listeners to benefit by their remarks. Yet even his obtuse conceit was struck by Catherine Murchison's manner. A sudden sense of distance and discomfort obtruded itself upon the gentleman's consciousness. He caught Porteus Carmagee's brown, bird-like eye, and the glint thereof was curiously disconcerting. "Expect you're busy. My wife's waiting for me. Mustn't delay." And he withdrew with a jerk of his peaked cap, repassing Murchison with an oblivious serenity, and rejoining his wife, who had acknowledged the presence of acquaintances by a single inclination of the head. "Insufferable ass! Where's that luggage? Ah, here we are." And Porteus opened the cab door with emphasis. "Get in, Kate. You'll find everything shipshape at home." "You will come across later?" "If I'm wanted." "Then we shall expect you both. We have not thanked you yet." "Oh, if I'm to be thanked, I shan't come." "Don't say that," and Murchison's hand rested for a moment on Porteus Carmagee's shoulder. Lombard Street again, broad, tranquil Lombard Street, warm with its red-walled houses, shaded by its cypresses, its budding elms and limes, St. Antonia's steeple clear against the blue, the old house itself white-sashed and sun-steeped, curtains at the windows, the steps white and fresh as snow. A head disappeared from the hall window as the cab drove up. The front door opened. They were welcomed by a homely and familiar face. "Mary!" "Yes, ma'am." "This is like home." "I'm glad, ma'am, I'm glad." Catherine kissed her. They were both good women, and heart met heart in that home-coming, so full of memories of mingled joy and pain. "It is good to see you here, Mary," and Murchison held out his hand. "Oh, sir, it was good to come." "You will only have one to worry you now." "It wasn't a worry, sir." And she retreated because her weakness was a woman's weakness and showed itself in tears. A man was helping the cabman with the luggage. He came in carrying one end of a heavy trunk, cap in hand, gaiters on legs, a smart figure that seemed a little faded and out of fortune, to judge by the threadbare cleanliness of his clothes. "What, you here, Gage?" The man coloured up like a boy. "Glad to see you, sir, and you, ma'am. The old house begins to look itself again." "You are right, Gage. Old faces make a welcome surer. We shall want you if you are free." "Only too happy, sir. Family man now, sir." "What, married?" "A year last Easter, sir." And he disappeared up the stairs, carrying the lower end of the trunk. An hour had passed. Husband and wife had wandered over the whole house together, and found many an old familiar friend that had been saved from the wreck of that disastrous year. The sympathetic touch showed everywhere, A reverent and sensitive spirit had schemed and plotted to retain the past. The colouring of each room was the same as of old. Much of the furniture had been rebought. The very pictures were as so many memories. It was home, and yet not the home they had known of yore. Does it feel strange to you? Strange? Yes, it is all so real, and yet there is something we shall always miss. They were standing together at the study window, looking out into the garden that was lit with flowers. Polyanthuses were as so many gems scattered on the brown earth of the beds. An almond tree was still in bloom, a blush of pink against the sky. Tulips, red, white, and yellow, lifted their cups to the falling dew. It can never be the same, dear. No. Gwen? Yes, our little one. And yet, in death. In death? My child has given me victory over myself. As I trust God, dear, I believe that curse is dead. Yes, it is dead. The house is cleansed. We have come home together. I am ready now to face my fellow men. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. It is said that a pretty woman is never out of patience when she has a glass to gaze at, and Betty Steele, casting critical yet complacent glasses into the depths of a Venetian mirror, awaited the descent of her very particular friend, Madge Ellison, with the sweet content of a lily waiting for the moon. Mrs. Betty's face was a Diana's face, but her body was of the colour of a blush rose in her summer rose dress. The figure had charm enough as it idled to and fro in the spacious, mellow-tinted room. Mirror and window showed her patronage. The one symbolical of self alone, the other of that same self's outlook upon life at large. Betty was in one of her most radiant moods. A letter had come for her from her husband by the morning post. His eyes were much better, and there was no cloud upon the horizon. Parker Steele's wife heard the frou-frou of a silk petticoat sweeping down the stairs, the sudden opening of the study door, a man's footstep crossing the hall. "What, out to tea again in your best frock?" The rustling of silk ceased for a moment at the foot of the stairs. Betty Steele smiled like a wise and intelligent elder sister. Madge Ellison and their most stylish locum tenens, Dr. Little, had reached that degree of familiarity that permits two people to spar amiably with each other. "A grievance, as usual. I suppose you grudge us the carriage." "Nothing half so selfish, I assure you." "Why not come and pay calls with us?" "The old proverb, Miss Ellison. A little goes a long way, is that it?" "Am I so little?" "What's in a name?" And she passed on with a significant side glance and an arch lifting of the chin. Dr. Little, a black-chinned, tailor-waisted, superfine person, with a distinct air, proceeded on a hypothetical expedition up the stairs. He had remembered leaving his latchkey in his bedroom, a useful excuse for meeting a pretty woman on the way, as though the coincidence were supremely natural. Au revoir. Miss Ellison favoured him with an undeniable wink as she picked up a pink parasol from the hall table. She was one of those women who remind one forcibly of the stage beauty as seen on very young men's mantelpieces. Madge Ellison would show as much of an open-work stocking as was compatible with social refinement. A retroussé nose and a round and rather cheeky chin associated themselves naturally with her methods of fascination. "Madge!" "Yes, dear." "Here, quick, I want you." "Bless my soul, why this tragic note?" "Look, the window. Do you recognize any one by the church railings?" There was a hard abruptness in Betty Steele's voice. She was leaning forward with her hand on the window-sill, her face curiously changed in its expression from the purring contentment of 2 minutes ago. I see a solitary female, dear. Don't you recognize her?" Miss Ellison gave a quaint and expressive little whistle. "No, surely it can't be." "Kate Murchison." "By George, dear, it is!" The two friends watched the figure in black disappear under the old gatehouse that stood at the northwest corner of the square. For Madge Ellison there was nothing more inspiriting than curiosity in the event. To Betty Steele that passing glimpse had opened up all the hatred of the past. "What's in your mind, Madge?" Miss Ellison was buttoning her gloves. "I'll bet a tea-cake to a penny bun, dear, that it is the Murchisons who have taken their house in Lombard Street again." "Nonsense!" Betty Steele's eyes grew hard and dangerous at the suggestion. "Why nonsense? The Murchisons would hardly have the impudence to sneak back to Roxton. People don't care to be bungled into the next world by a drunkard." "My word, Betty, draw it mild. I never heard that the man drank." "You were in Italy then, I believe." "Nasty, nasty. You are peevish over the poor people's failings." "I hate that woman, Madge." Miss Ellison laughed at the sincerity of her friend's spite. "Why, what earthly harm can that woman do you by choosing to live in Roxton?" "I tell you, Madge, there are some people in this world who set one's teeth on edge. After all, what need for all this waste of antipathy? Kate Murchison must be staying with the Carmagees. I'll risk that as my explanation." Spirited away on a round of social duties, Betty Steele and her friend paid their third call that afternoon at the Canonry in Canon's Court, off Cloister Street. A row of carriages under the avenue of limes, and a liveried servant standing on duty under the Georgian portico, reminded Betty Steele that the third Friday in the month was the date printed on Mrs. Stensley's cards. Betty and her gossip were announced in the crowded drawing-room, where a number of bored figures were balancing teacups and talking with forced animation. A few men, severely saddened by their responsibilities, were treading on each other's heels, and looking anxiously for ladies who would take pity on sandwiches or cake. The French windows of the room were open to the May sunshine of the garden, and the fringes of a cedar could be seen sweeping the sleek grass. Individual faces disassociate themselves slowly from such an assemblage, and Betty Steele, blockaded under the lee of a grand piano, had but half the room under the ken of her keen eyes. Madge Ellison had been left to chat with Mr. Keighley, a very popular and enthusiastic curate, who had rendered his character doubly fascinating by professing to hold prejudices in favour of celibacy. Betty had a brewer's wife at her elbow. They had exchanged ecstatic confidences on the exquisite shape and colour of Mrs. Stensley's tea service, and were both groping for some further topic to keep the conversation moving. "And how is the play going, Mrs. Steele?" "The play?" Mrs. Betty seemed unusually pensive and distraught. "Lady Sophia's play?" "As well as a piece can go, with amateurs. We all find fault with our neighbours." "I hear it is a splendid little play." "Not at all bad. I must say I like the pathetic style of play." "Oh, yes, quite charming. I saw Julia Neilson play in that part. Oh, what was the play called?" "A woman of no ideal, most likely," thought Mrs. Betty. "I wonder how many more times she is going to read on that one unfortunate word." She waited demurely for the title to recur, but it appeared lost in the limbo of the fat lady's mind. The brewer's wife continued to grope for it like a conscientious housewife who has lost the Sabbath threepenny bit in her glove-box while dressing for church. Betty Steele, however, had become utterly oblivious to her presence for the moment. She was gazing towards one of the open windows, where a woman's figure, tall and comely in simple black, showed against the rich green of the grass. The woman's back was turned towards the room, but Betty knew her by her figure and the lustre of her hair. "Very odd, Mrs. Steele. I can't remember the name of that play." "Really, I beg your pardon. I was thinking of other things." A slight rearranging of this aggregate of Roxton culture released Betty Steele from this amiable mass of irresponsible bathos. She contrived to wedge herself beside Madge Ellison, whose retroussé nose had failed to tempt the celibate to expand. "You see?" A smart hat was tilted significantly towards the window. "I do. Any news?" "You have lost, dear. The tea-cake is on top." "The sensation of Roxton. They are here to stay." Mrs. Betty's face expressed infinite pity. "How eccentric!" "Kate Murchison has had money left her." "And the husband?" "I hear his plate is up in Lombard Street." Whether it was a mere matter of coincidence or the working of a definite purpose, the fact was curiously self-evident to Betty Steele that the drawing-room of the canonry had divided itself into two camps. Windowward sat Miss Carmagee, dressed in black, her large face shining like a buckler against the embattled foe. Porteus, the irascible Porteus, who blasphemed all tea-parties, was chattering like a little brown baboon. Several of Kate Murchison's old friends appeared to have congregated together on the opposition benches. Mrs. Betty remarked all this, and her mouth grew a mere line in her pale and alert face. The breweress had risen to depart. A number of nervous people who had been waiting for some bold spirit to initiate the movement followed the fat lady's inspiriting example. Mrs. Stensley was in the garden. The breweress and her flock of sheep filed through the open window to shake hands and go. "Madge, hello, dear, am I sitting on you? Whither away?" "To pay my most dutiful respects." Catherine Murchison and the canon had left the window and were pacing the grass under the benisons of the great cedar. By the expression on their faces and the serious yet sympathetic inflection of their voices, they had broken the mere social surface and were speaking of deeper things. It is the fashion to abuse the priesthood in the abstract, yet any critic who took the clean-girt manliness of Canon Stensley's character might find his rhetoric chilled in its free flow. "You have done the right thing, and your true friends will be glad of it." "It was my husband's wish." "The wish of a brave man." "What a wonderful thing is sympathy! You have helped me so much this afternoon. It was an ordeal. You know, we dread the unknown, uncertainty." The big, grey-headed man looked down at her with much of the affection of a father. His hands had given her confirmation and joined her in marriage. "Doubt is a great distorting glass," he said simply. "The difficulties of life decrease the moment they are faced." "I am glad you are on our side." "I should be a poor Christian if I were not." A figure in a pink dress, sumptuous and perfect as to the milliner's craft, glided across the grass and cast a shadow at Catherine's feet. "How do you do, Kate? You have surprised us all, assuredly." The two women touched hands. Betty Steele's drawl ascended towards patronage. She assumed the air of a mistress of a salon whose salutation decided destinies and dispensed fame. "How is Dr. Murchison? This long rest must have done him good." "Thanks, my husband is very well." "I am afraid we all misunderstood your plans. We thought you had left Roxton for good. I suppose Dr. Murchison will not expose himself again to the strain of general practice. Surgical cases are such a responsibility." It is the ability of women to be politely insolent and to cover a taunt with ironical courtesy. There were at least a dozen people within range of Mrs. Betty's aggressive drawl, and Betty Steele had no intention of letting Roxton forget James Murchison's past. "And how are the children?" Her eyes were studying the details of Catherine's dress with the critical acuteness so trying to a woman. "The boy is very well, thanks." "And the other, a girl, was it not?" "You need not trouble to remember her." "That sounds as though you were disappointed. I remember how you used to read me texts on the divinity of motherhood." "The child is dead, Betty. That is all." "I am sorry to hear that. I always thought the girl was delicate." Canon Stensley's massive shadow interposed itself between the slighter silhouettes upon the grass. "Your husband has kept his promise, Mrs. Murchison." "Is he here?" "Yes, yonder, with my wife." Betty Steele's face was tinged with malignity that leaked from her eyes and from the sneering angles of her mouth. She felt glad that Catherine's favourite child was dead. The incomprehensible malice in the thought justified itself in the reflection that Catherine had lost something that she, Betty, had always lacked. She passed James Murchison as she returned towards the house, a man with a certain dignity of past suffering writ heavily upon his face. He was talking to two old friends. Betty swept by him without troubling to notice whether he bowed to her or not. The man was a mere pawn in the game, so far as she was concerned. Any humiliation that he might suffer was only valuable so far as it humiliated his wife. The carriage was waiting for them under the limes of Canon's Court. Madge Ellison flounced down in her corner with a relieved sigh. "What a function! Well, how is she? Charming as ever?" "Who?" "You know who I mean, Betty." "That beast? I heard you call her that once when we were at school." And Miss Ellison tittered. "I believe she'll make the whole town swallow the past." "Will she, indeed?" "You don't relish the idea?" "Wait, my dear girl. We have not seen the end of the game yet." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. Roxton, like a certain lady of literary fame, was ever ready with its free opinions on any subject that it did not understand. The return of the Murchisons had exercised the town's capacity for criticism, and inaugurated a debate that was to be heard at public-house bars, as well as in the parlours of the pious. The facts of the case were generally agreed upon, but facts are things that the ingenious mind of man can juggle with. The complexion of the affair varied with the convictions of the debater, and the sacred incidents of home life profaned or honoured according to the temper of the tongue that dealt with them. In Mill Lane, the case had a most energetic exponent in the person of Mr. William Baines, the sweep. A certain brewer's drayman, who had won some crude celebrity as an atheist, had taken upon himself to argue on the adverse side. The two gentlemen squared to each other one evening at the bottom of the lane, and thrashed it out strenuously before a meagre but attentive crowd. "What about the inquest? Didn't we read the 'ole of it in the Mail and Times? You can't get away from facts, can you?" "And supposin' he did make a mistake for once, does that mean calling a man a fool and a danger to the public? Who drove his cart last week into a pillar-box by Wilson's grocery shop?" Mr. Baines scored a palpable hit. The audience laughed. "Got him there, William," said a neighbour. The drayman sniffed and threw out his stomach. "Facts is facts. Doctrine ain't driving 'osses." "Thank the Lord, Mr. Sweetyer, it ain't for our sakes." "I say," the man blundered. "And who hasn't run his nose into a lamp-post on occasions? Why, look here," and Mr. Baines stretched out a didactic forefinger. "When my little girl had the diphtheria, who pulled her through? And who saved old Jenny Lowther's leg? And there was young Ben Thompson, who some London joker swore was a dying man." "That's true," said a bony woman in an old red blouse. The drayman, finding the neighbours inclined to take the sweep's view of the matter, began to look hot and a little nettled. "Well, what have you got to say about the booze?" he asked. "I reckon that's more your business than mine." Again the audience caught the jibe and laughed. "3 gallons a day, that's his measure," interjected a morose gentleman who was hanging over his garden gate and smoking the stump of a clay pipe. "Wasn't he carried home from the club?" "P'raps he was, p'raps he wasn't. Any fool could have seen that the man had been working hisself to death. Why, he fainted bang off one morning round at our house. Ask my missus, A thimbleful of brandy would have made a man in his state hug the railings." "Anyhow, he hugged 'em," said the obdurate opponent. "We ain't always responsible for what we do when we've had a bad smack over the side of the jaw. Doctors oughtn't to touch it." "You're a nice one to preach now, ain't you?" "He is that," quoth the laconic worthy at the gate. "Look here, don't you go shoving it into me, sideways. Let me argue him, Mr. Cat." "Argue? You ain't got a leg to stand on." "Haven't I, my boy?" And the two disputants began to glare. The drayman wiped his hands on the back of his breeches. "Some fool'll be calling me a liar soon," he remarked. "It's on the cards." "Look here, Bill Baines, I've had enough of your sarce. Stow it. You go and bully your kids. Can't I speak my mind when I bloomin' well like?" "Course he can," said the lady in the red blouse, "and he speaks it well, he does. Murchison was always a right down gentleman. Better than that there little nip of Steele." "Right for you, Mrs. Penny. We don't go blackguarding other people's characters, do we?" "I ain't blackguarding them, man. I'm stating facts." "Facts, facts. Why, the man's clean daft on facts. Facts must be another name for a pint of bitter." "I'll smash your jaw, Bill Baines, if you don't stow it." "Smash away, my buck. Who's afraid of a blooming cask?" Whereon the dwellers in Mill Lane were treated to an exhibition of 2 minutes' straight hitting, an exhibition that ended in the intervention of friends. But since the drayman departed with a red nose and a swollen eye, it may be inferred that the sweep had the best of the argument. To have one's past, present, and future dragged through the back streets of a country town is not an experience that a man of self-respect would welcome. A sensitive spirit cannot fail to feel the atmosphere about it. It may see the sun shining, the clouds white against the blue, the natural phenomena of health and of well-being, or the faces of a man's fellows may be as sour puddles to him, their sympathy a wet December. Trite as the saying is, that in trouble we make trial of our friends, only those who have faced defeat know the depth and meaning of that time-worn saying. A week in Roxton betrayed to Catherine and her husband the number and the sincerity of their friends. The instinct of pride is wondrous quick in detecting truth from shams, even as an expert's fingers can tell old china by the feel. The population of the place was soon mapped out into the priggishly polite, the piously distant, the vulgarly inquisitive, the unaffected honest, and the honestly indifferent. Catherine met many a face that brightened to hers in the Roxton streets. The past seemed to have banked more goodwill for them than they had imagined. It was among the poor that they found the least forgetfulness, less of the cultured and polite hauteur, less affectation, less hypocrisy. As for the practice, they found it non-existent that first humiliating yet half-happy week. But perhaps the sincerest person in Roxton at that moment was the wife of Dr. Parker Steel. Betty was not a passionate woman in the matter of her affections, but in her capabilities for hatred she concentrated the energy of 10. She had come quite naturally to regard herself as the most gifted and interesting feminine personality that Roxton could boast. Every woman has an instinctive conviction that her own home and her own children are immeasurably superior to all others. With Betty Steele, this spirit of womanly egotism had been largely centred on herself. She had no children to make her jealous and critical towards other women's children. It was the symmetry of her own success in life that had developed into an enthralling art, an art that absorbed her whole soul. It might have been imagined that she had climbed too high to trouble about an old hate, that she was too sufficiently assured of her own glory to stoop to attack a humbled rival. Jealousy and a sneaking suspicion of inferiority had embittered the feud for her of old, and Kate Murchison, saddened and aged, half a suppliant for the loyalty of a few good friends, could still inspire in Betty a spirit of aggressive and impatient hate. She remembered that she had seen Catherine triumphant where she herself had received indifference and disregard. The instinct to crush this antipathetic rival was as fierce and keen in her as ever. "Call on her," had been Madge Ellison's suggestion. "Call on her? It would be more diplomatic. Do you imagine, Madge, that I am going to make advances to that woman? She used to snub me once. My turn has come. I give the Murchisons just 6 months in Roxton." How little mercy Betty Steele had in that intolerant and subtle heart of hers was betrayed by the strategic move that opened the renewal of hostilities. She had driven Kate Murchison out of Roxton once, and the arrogance of conquest was as fierce in this slim, refined-faced woman as in any Alexander. She moved in a small and limited sphere, but the aggressive spirit was none the less inevitable in its lust to overthrow. The motives were the meaner for their comparative minuteness. Lady Sophia's Bazaar Committee met in Roxton Public Hall one day towards the end of May, to consider the arrangement of stalls and to settle a number of decorative details. Betty had spent half the morning at her escritoire, sorting letters, meditating chin on hand, scribbling on the backs of old envelopes, which she afterwards took care to burn. She seemed in her happiest vein that afternoon as she left Madge Ellison to provide tea for Dr. Little, and drove to the public hall with her dispatch box full of the Bazaar Fund's correspondence. No one would have imagined it possible for such refinement and charm to cover instincts that were not unallied to the instincts found in an Indian jungle. Mrs. Betty went through her business with briskness and precision. The committee left their chairs to discuss the grouping of the stalls about the room. There were to be 12 of these booths, each to represent a familiar flower. Lady Sophia had elected herself a rose. Mrs. Betty's choice had been oriental poppies. Lady Sophia was parading the hall with a pair of pince-nez perched on the bridge of her nose, and a memorandum book open in her hand. A group of deferential ladies followed her like hens about a farmer's wife at feeding time. The most trivial suggestion that fell from those aristocratic lips was seized upon and swallowed with relish. "Betty, dear, have you heard from Jennings about the draperies?" The glory of it to be "my deared" in public by Lady Sophia Gillingham. "Yes, I have a letter somewhere, and a list of prices." "You might pin up the letter and the price list on the black board by the door, so that the stall holders can take advantage of any item that may be of use to them." Betty moved to the table and rummaged amid her multifarious correspondence. She was chatting all the while to a Miss Cousins, a thin, wiry little woman, alert as a Scotch terrier in following up the scent of favour. "What a lot of work the bazaar has given you, Mrs. Steele." "Yes, quite enough," and she divided her attention between Miss Cousins and the pile of papers. "When is the next rehearsal?" "Tuesday, I believe." "I hear you are a genius of the play." "Am I?" And Betty smiled like an ingenuous girl. "I am most horribly nervous. I always feel that I am spoiling the part. Oh, here's Jennings's letter and the list, I think." She left the 2 papers lying unheeded for the moment, while she answered Miss Cousins's interested questions on costume. "Primrose and leaf green, that will be lovely." "Yes, so everybody says." Lady Sophia's voice interrupted the gossip. She was beckoning to Betty with her memorandum book. "Betty, can you spare me a moment?" Miss Cousins's sharp eyes gave an envious twinkle. "Shall I pin up the papers for you, Mrs. Steele?" "Would you?" "With pleasure." And Betty swept 2 sheets of paper towards Miss Cousins without troubling to glance at them, and turned to wait on Lady Sophia. Several guests congregated about the blackboard as Miss Cousins pinned up the letter and the price list with such conscientious promptitude that she had not troubled to read their contents. Had she had eyes for the faces of her neighbours, she might have been struck by the puzzled eagerness of their expression. One elderly committee woman readjusted her glasses, and then touched Miss Cousins with a pencil that she carried. "Excuse me." "Yes?" "There is some mistake, I think." "Mistake?" "Yes, that letter," and the spectacled lady pointed to the blackboard with her pencil. Miss Cousins took the trouble to investigate the charge. The letter was written on one broad sheet in a neat, bold hand. Miss Cousins' prim little mouth pursed itself up expressively as she read. Her brows contracted, her eyes stared. "Good heavens! What's this? I must have taken the wrong letter." She tore the sheet down, pushed past her neighbours, and crossed the room towards Betty Steele. The group about the blackboard appeared to be discussing the incident. Mr. Jennings's list of silks and drapings seemed forgotten. "Mrs. Steele, excuse me." "Yes?" "This letter. There's some mistake. It's the wrong one. I pinned it up, and Mrs. Saker called my attention to the error." "Let me see." Miss Cousins gave her the sheet, intense curiosity quivering in every line of her dog-like face. "Good heavens! How did this get mixed up with my business correspondence?" She looked perturbation to perfection. "Miss Cousins, what am I to do? Has anyone read it?" The little woman nodded. "How horrible! I must explain. It must not go any further." Betty hurried across the hall towards the door, hesitated, and looked round her as though baffled by indecision. She knew well enough that inquisitive eyes were watching her. Her skill as an actress, and she was consummately clever as a hypocrite, served to heighten the meaning that she wished to convey. "Lady Sophia." Betty had doubled adroitly in the direction of the amiable aristocrat. "Yes, dear." "Can I speak to you alone?" "What is it?" "Oh, I have done such an awful thing. Do help me. You have so much nerve and tact." "My dear child, steady yourself." "I looked out Jennings's papers. Miss Cousins was chattering to me, and when you called me she offered to pin the things on the board. How on earth it happened I cannot imagine, but a private letter of mine got mixed up with the bizarre correspondence. It must have been lying by Jennings's list, for Miss Cousins, without troubling to read it, pinned it on the board." The perturbed, sensitive creature was breathless and all aflutter. Lady Sophia patted her arm. "Well, dear, I see no great harm yet." "Wait, it was a letter from an old friend abroad, a letter that contained certain confessions about a Roxton family. What on earth am I to do? Look, here it is. Read it." Lady Sophia read the letter, holding it at arm's length like the music of a song. "Good heavens, Betty, I never knew the man drank. That it had been a habit—" "Don't, Lady Sophia, don't." "You should have been more careful." I know. I shall never forgive myself. For goodness' sake, help me. You have so much more tact than I." Her ladyship accepted the responsibility with stately unction. "Leave it to me, dear. I can go round and have a quiet talk with all those who happened to read the letter. How unfortunate that the opening sentences should have contained this information. Still, it needed never get abroad." "How good of you." "There, dear, you are rather upset, most naturally so." "I think I had better retreat." "Yes, leave it to me." "Thank you, oh, so much. Tell them not to whisper a word of it." "There will be no difficulty, dear, about that." Betty, white and troubled, added a sharper flavour to the stew by withdrawing dramatically from the stage. And anyone wise as to the contradictoriness of human nature could have prophesied how the news would spread had he seen the Lady Sophia voyaging on her diplomatic mission round the hall. Poor Mrs. Steele! Such an unfortunate coincidence! Not a woman easily upset, but believe me, my dear Mrs. So-and-so, it was as much a shock to her as though she had heard the news of her husband. Now I am quite sure this unpleasant affair will go no further. Of course not. I rely absolutely on your discretion." And since the discretion of a provincial town is complex to a degree of an ever-repeated confession, coupled with a solemn warning against repetition, it was not improbable that this froth would haunt the pot for many a long day. End of Chapter 33.